to discuss briefly now the lectures, and then you have the possibility to also ask questions or give comments. My first question would be to Jon Wood. When you look to the photographs of the studios of Katharina Grosse with the eyes, you looked at the Henry Moore photographs or the Brancusi studio, what would you say is the difference and what is similar?
It's a great question. I mean, my first response was to, well, my question for Katharina through that was, I was wondering, with all this wonderful openness, transparency, but also on the other side, one kind of fascinating closure and walling, how you might go, how an artist who set up a place like this might go about controlling studio photography, conducting a studio visit. I mean, there's actually a very interesting link with Henry Moore, because when you said that when people come to your house, you meet them in the office room, and if you like them, they graduate to the workplace upstairs where they might see more. In the case of Henry Moore, he would do very similar things. He would meet them in his house, in his sitting room, and if he liked the look of them, they would then be taken to the studios in the workplace. So I was, obviously I've never been to Katharina's studio home, but I was curious about the, how the studio visit was conducted, and how photography was used to demonstrate certain lighting conditions, certain spaces. That would be one response, and I guess the second was that with Katharina saying that she doesn't work directly on the wall, and that was an important factor, I was wondering to what extent the studio that you'd set up sets up a certain restricted viewing opportunity. There's only so much distance that you can get from the wall, from the work, and whether you maybe wish that the studio is a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, or maybe you might graduate to a space that has other opportunities. Or so that in terms of your question, those are my kind of responses, more kind of questions, more questions for you, Katharina.
Yeah, there is a lot of different questions,
yeah,
right?
Sure.
So, I mean, the way that people come to the studio, of course, because they want to see the house. So there's people coming to the house that don't necessarily know my work. That's one thing. And that start to then talk about the work when they come to the studio. I mean, like tourists, really. It has nothing to do with an expert coming to the studio to want to discuss the work. So that is something that I did, though, at the beginning, because I wanted to see what people said that wouldn't choose to see my work, really. So it was a little bit like, from both sides, a surprise. But the other thing is that I stopped that now. And I don't have studio photography happening, really, me in the studio. I don't like it at all. And I'm not so fond of me being photographed when I'm working, either. And I'm starting to be more restrictive to have people come to the studio, because the studio I built the studio because I wanted to understand my canvas work more thoroughly and how it was differing from the work I did in situ. And I didn't show you anything because I thought the time wasn't enough for that. But what I really realized was, and that was fantastic and had to do with that clarity of that space, that my canvas work is more, far more condensed. So in the installations I expand, I enlarge, I actually make little things more visible and make it slow. So the time frame is slow, long, expanded. And it happens only in 5 or 6 days or sometimes 10 days. Whereas with the canvas work, I compress, I have a small space with very complex movements, very many layers that kind of contradict one another and that also are being painted over a longer period of time. So they have a totally different ability for me to think about painting, activity, thought, and dimensions. And that leads me to your next question, whether I would maybe want another place. And that's true. I'm thinking of something different. I would like to have something that's all on one level, because I think that the stairs are so dramatic that when I go from one place to the next, I'm right away. It's a real cut into the thought process. And I like this gradual thinking, this kind of flow, stream-like thinking, and that's become more and more important to me. So I'm thinking that moving from here to here and going maybe 20 steps downstairs is has a too dramatic impact on the development of things. And I would also like to have different spaces one to one another that are going slower from the areas into the next area. So this is like, so it's really thought out, you know. I thought, okay, storage, office, books, cooking, you know, that's, but now that I've been using it and living in it, I think it is different. So I would like to have spaces where you only look at work, maybe, where I look at work, or where I have different things together for a longer time. And yeah, so like 1,000 square meters would be great, and like one big pancake, you know. So.
And would you then sell the house or rent the house out to somebody else, the house you're now in, or would it be in addition? Like
I don't know. I mean, I actually bought a supermarket early on, and I thought the supermarket could be the studio, because I was thinking, okay, Berlin, there is maybe churches, supermarkets, or gyms that could be studios. So I looked at all these different things, and I bought that supermarket. It's a beautiful bungalow-like in the eastern part of the city, and I somehow didn't sell it. I realized I can't do the studio there because it was too small after a little closer looking. And I forgot about it, you know. And now I'm living in the supermarket. I'm not living in the studio anymore. So I'm now living in the supermarket and go to the studio.
It's very good. A lot of the people,
which is great. It's great.
A lot of the people I were looking at have studios that are also homes. And in the period I was looking at on my presentation, there's a kind of general kind of idea that within these studio homes, that work becomes of the artist, work is of the rather than by them. So it seems to kind of facilitate a biographical reading of the work. And I was wondering, with you having a studio home, whether there's been more, people have been more encouraged to think about your work in biographical ways and read into that because you happen to live in close proximity to where you work. Is there a kind of enhancing of the biographical reading? Which happened, for example, with Brancusi, that's often taken on as, you know.
Yeah, I think this. I think people love to look at the work with a biographical reading, and I find it very hard to let people do so. Yeah, I'm even thinking whether I could invent a narrative somehow, because I've been owning very little for a long time. I don't have many things. You know, when I moved into that house, I only had all my work, but I had like 2 beds. That was all I had, really, and clothes. So there is not so much biographic indications you can give. You know, there is not the, you know, the display of the, for example, my library. We talked about it when we had coffee, but it is really an erratic collection of books. It's nothing like, you know, where you can understand, oh, that's what yeah, right, you know, that kind of thing is not really possible. Or my music collection is equally weird. So you can't go, oh, there's interests, that makes sense, you know, you can't really like Sherlock Holmes around and pinpoint down that. I find narration a difficult thing because my work is so opposed to it. And I'm so opposed to the narrative as an explanatory system, and I also don't think that way. And my work is, I'm working in a field that is pre-nominal, that is actually not, I'm not using pop art devices such as image quotes or photography or things that can be named. I'm really working in the area of pre-language thought. And I'm fascinated by it, and I find it very irritating to give information. So I'm really thinking of what could I say, you know. And I'd like to talk about the work, that's the problem. I mean, I like to talk, but how could that talk look or sound? Yeah. And the studio is in a sense, then, you know, maybe that's an interesting thing that we're, the studio maybe is something that says something, but not in that sense, like I mean, I'm contradicting myself also because I showed the egg and the first little photograph. Yeah.
There is one question I would like to pose before I ask the audience. You said that your studio, your house is also a statement for the position of the artist within the city, and this is also what Philipp Ursprung says in his article in the book about your studio. What would you say, what is your statement? What are you stating with your house?
Oh, that I'm visible with my work in society. I'm not somewhere hidden and can make do with whatever is being left over. And I'm in the center, I'm not in the peripheral outside, which is all my studios have been in the peripheral of a city so far, because that's the cheapest and the leftover, and I think that I require and deserve a different way to work, and to also very casual. No carpenter would accept to work with minus 20 degrees and do some fantastic work. They would all require to have their tools and everything in place, and I do the same. For my way to work, I mean, there are totally different ways. I mean, I have friends who would never be able to work in a studio like this because it would not make sense with their practice.
So would you have any questions? Yes, please.
You know the movie The Visit with Judy Winter?
No.
Okay.
It was a very good question. Do you know the movie The Visit?
Besuch. So no other questions?
I would be interested in what happens to your installations after the show is gone, after the show is over. There were these huge, this large material, these very gigantic things. What happens to them? Is that stored or archived, or is it, or are you throwing it away?
Yeah, it gets all painted over, what is part of the house, and sometimes I can maybe use things, but very rarely. The paintings that have been part of the installational work, I tend to keep and maybe use them in different spaces again, so that they kind of collect another little visual information, let's say, and then they get at some point, sometimes I keep them and leave them like this as singular works and show them maybe also in just painting shows, but most of the times I think all the pieces you've seen here, apart from the large sculptural things at the end, they are all gone, I guess. So in terms of a retrospective, for example, it would be a little difficult.
I have a question to the window in your studio. Do you invent it for yourself, or I thought it's a kind of image of Adolf Loser's room plan, who thinks from inside to outside and gives some irritation to the buildings. And the other side would be interested is your art is very free form and free color fluiding, and the building stands in a quite hard contrast. It's reduced, it's only concrete and glass and hard edges. Please, can you say some words about it?
You mean the window, a colorful window you are talking about?
This one which is not in the middle of the, which is in the middle of the...
right, yeah. No, this is not, this is the architect's idea, and that was so interesting because I was a little reluctant to build this concrete cast simple structure, because it made me really think of the 60s, and I'm from an industrial area in Germany that you know, the Ruhr area, and that area has exactly that history. They had coal mining and steel industry, and then car industry would come in, like, I mean, Leeds or Manchester or Birmingham has seen that as well, and then at some point they were building large universities, and the Ruhr Universität in Bochum was built also, that was in place cast concrete, like bam, 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 and I was brought up in a way that I was told this is beautiful and great and a new thing happening here, you know, and we all loved it, and I thought, oh, maybe that's too much backwards to what I know and where I came from. Shouldn't it be totally different? But then the architects talked to me about how they design the skin and how they understand the skin that is actually coming towards the core of the building, and how actually not only the skin but what happens before the skin. And they were referring to this really interesting little text by Slutsky and Rowe, which is called Transparency. I don't know whether you have heard about it. It's really interesting to read. It discusses the Gropius concept versus the Corbusier concept, and how the skin and the inside can maybe differ and generate a feeling when you go through the house that is never ending and always interesting. And that is exactly the experience I've made. And when I read this little text, I decided to work with the architects, because they said that their thoughts and belief system was rooted in these criteria that were coming up there. And I have to say, it really works. When you're in the house, you have, according to the light that comes in, from, be it skylight or the lights from the windows, you have always such a different spatial notion that's formed through the light. That's really fantastic. I really love the daylight impact you can experience, and you wouldn't think so maybe when you see that big block, you know, as you say, it looks like boom, like bunker style. But as you then move inside and you look at it more clearly, you see all these large windows, and actually a lot of light and irritation comes about. So it's actually an interesting system that is rigid, apparently, I mean, on a superficial, on the first moment you encounter the structure, you would think that, but then as you go through it, it is quite organic. But the second part, what you say, what I think about it now, I would be interested in trying something very different. Yeah. I mean, I was also a little shocked. I've never built, and when I saw what came out of those little harmless thoughts, you know, oh, I wish like I had a studio in the middle of the city, and then I come there and there's this big concrete thing on a compound that's actually from the 19th century. I was a little also worried that I had, you make something that doesn't disappear so fast. Whereas with painting you can, you know, it's a very fluid, as you say, a soft, fast thinking process that can be eliminated with not a lot of effort. And but I like this friction between the analytical and this emotional, intuitive, stream-like thinking that I have. I'm also using a lot of analytical techniques, I guess, to look at my work. So I don't think there's a contradiction in a sense, but it's a weird paradox too, I do think. But I'd be very interested to have another building that's also built in a different way, a little more. Also, I think it's not very eco-conscious, which is a big downside. I mean, it is in terms of its consumption of energy. It's amazing. I don't need any energy really because it's so tight. So the heat is so well conserved. But I mean, concrete leaves a really bad blueprint in terms of energy consumption, and that is not a good thing. I agree.
I was just wondering, given that you see your work as entering into a sort of symbiotic relationship with the internal, I guess, the internal side of an object, is there any sort of kind of architectural container that you would refuse to work with? Have you ever refused a space that has been proposed to you? Or is there any kind of internal space that you would sort of dislike? working with?
Yeah, there is.
What would that be?
Yeah, if I can't connect with the space somehow.
And has that happened in the past?
Yeah. It has to do with many things. It can be the people, or it can be somehow that it's too far, or it can be that I can't envision anything, or it can have many. I mean, I think our relationship with our surroundings are very intense. I mean, more intensive than we maybe sometimes think. And if it doesn't work out, or also if I can't do things that I find thrilling or new, I can't work there either. So at the beginning there were these moments when I did a lot of paintings in staircases, because you could move up and down and see it from above. But then when you're like the 20th time of, oh, you're the one that does those great staircase lobby paintings, that kind of in-between, the in-between space situations came up very often after a little while. So there was then less engagement from my side to do that. But that's a great question. I mean, I think you can't expose the work no matter what. There's always this symbiosis. So if the support gets subtracted, what is left, and so on. So you have to see how that works.
There was another question.
Hi. The question I'm interested in is, you were talking or referring to the other question about your paintings being dissolved at some point. And you were saying you were rarely keeping parts of your paintings to reuse them. And to me, it seems connected to you having this very strong attitude of being possessionless, or living very unconnected to something materialistic. And I was wondering whether you dissolving your paintings, or dissolving your work, not keeping it, was connected to that possessionlessness you keep practicing. And my question is actually if that dissolving, this temporary part of your art, is an integral part of it, or if it's just your comfort zone, I guess.
Yeah, it could be my comfort zone. I feel comfortable with. That's true. But I think there is,
do you think there's maybe something you're avoiding by doing that?
Could be. Maybe you know what it is.
I don't know, I'm asking you. I'm just wondering.
Yeah. I was, at the beginning when I was doing these larger wall paintings with the spray gun, I made little models, and I was really eager to make exactly what I did in the model. So I set a couple of rules to myself, for example, only 3 colors. The first color is yellow, may not appear on the second color. The second color goes on the first color, may not appear on the third color. The third color goes on the first and the second color. And then, when you know that you have these 3 colors, so the first color may not cover everything, because otherwise the 2 other ones would not have enough space. So I was negotiating, a little bit like playing chess with yourself. And I thought it was, and I had this, I asked myself, why am I doing this, I had this little maquette, like a little spatial thing, and I would look at it, and then I would look at the wall painting, and I was so stressed out that it would look different or not be the right thing, and that I thought that was really wrong. After the 3rd wall painting I did, I made this decision that I'm restricting myself so much and controlling the work so much that it is not fun anymore. Why do I then have all this whole ado about, going to this space, painting it myself, if I'm so anxious to have it exactly how I envisioned it? And then I decided that nothing can go wrong. That was then another rule that I put out, It was always going to be fantastic. And that's maybe the problem, I guess. But it made me do a lot of things that I would not think of.
Yeah, but you know, if everything is interesting, everything is good, why erase it afterwards?
Sorry?
I'm just wondering, going back to that representational aspect of a thing being there, a painting being there, a possession being there. When you're saying in your work it's so important to accept everything as good, why don't let it exist?
You mean when the show is over?
Yeah. When it's
yeah, well, it's not... yeah, I let it exist in a sense. It's just painted over, you know, it's still there. I mean, I'm not painting it over.
But you were saying earlier, when you remove the object from the painting, from whatever it is, if it's a wall or a bookshelf, then the whole artwork is gone.
Oh, did I say that?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I would say it now differently. Yeah, I mean, that constellation is gone, you know, and then there's then another constellation coming about. I find that so fascinating that every second there's new constellations coming about, and they all have, in that very special situation, a certain value of, or denote, I don't know what's the word, they make sense, that structure that comes about, you know, so you take it apart and then you have a new situation. Why should I keep something that was made for a certain constellation?
I don't know. I guess this temporary. I really.
Perhaps we try to stop this psychoanalytic session at the moment. There would be.
We're getting so into it.
There is another question back there. You can continue at the dinner, perhaps.
I don't know if this will stop the psychoanalytical part of it. I was, since I've first seen the photos of the Brankosch studio quite a while ago, I was very much intrigued and impressed and thinking a lot about it. And I think the main goal behind this activity was not only the documentation, because Brankosch did the photos himself. So that was not only the documentation, but that was the definition of his sculptures. So he wanted to define the sculptures exactly in their juxtaposition, in the distance they had from one to the next. So this was like a paranoid approach to fix a certain image, yeah, which is quite contradictory to your approach, Katharina.
I was so much hoping that Jon is going
to... Do you want me to say something quickly? I mean, you're right. I mean, he didn't just use them to document the studio. He used them to interpret what he was doing and to kind of get some critical distance on it and capture the effects of light in the studio at certain times of day. And of course, with the comings and goings of things disappear and they dissolve and they get sold, they move on. So over I think by the end, there are about 750 photographs that he took from the early 20s through to the late 40s. They all have this kind of particular charge to them. Some of them are repeated installations, repeated ensembles that grow and consolidate over time. But I do think there's a very pragmatic point to that. I mean, that he was using much of his photography to speak for him in public. And it was a way of disseminating and circulating and distributing an idea and a changing idea of his work. So they're very powerful and potent interpretations, as well as, for many people, of course, standing as documents. I think some of the most intriguing ones are actually the worst ones, where he hasn't quite got it right, and it's a blurred corner, or it's the double image doesn't quite work properly. The archive is particularly rich in those, and they're often the ones, of course, that don't get published in you know, the well-circulated big books on the artist. It's always the finished, perfectly crisp, reflective, you know, ones that get circulated. That was my response.
Yeah, but I mean, I was a big fan of the Brancusi photographs. I've always been, also as a student, I was somehow fascinated, and I didn't know that this had happened already, and that he would make other things as well, you know, like his little teacups, or he would make the stove himself, you know, handmade stove, or the little letterbox. So I thought there was a lot of fiction happening in his studio as well, so which blended into that. Not only the photographic documentation or definition, but as well I thought it was creating what you would maybe also call a narration, or or what would be a narrative in a sense, or a plot that would be on top of that layer of the made object. And that kind of helped me to understand, I drew a lot from that, you know, for example, this idea of the experimental field that I thought was so fascinating, that this is not only the, I mean, him with his big bass, you know, that he played, or with the dog, or the teacup, or all the sculptures at the same time in different grades of finishedness, you know, or the unfinished column. And I thought there are a lot of really interesting open items that connect and let me come into the world that he at some point maybe polishes and has defined. You know, I think there are very many grades of definition in his work. And this idea of the experimental field being an open field, which even where I'm even part of, I'm one of the particles, you know. So I thought that was something that I got inspired by through Brancusi's setup.